This is BoomerLife on CL 650.
Welcome back to the program. We're talking about depression and anxiety with our guests from Neurokinetics Clinic. The president and founder is Philippe Silvestre, and the clinic manager is Sonia Dale. It's a pleasure to have you two here, and also we have another guest joining us on the line. Dorothy is with us from work, as a matter of fact. Dorothy, thanks for joining us. You're a former patient at Neurokinetics, correct?
That's correct. It's my pleasure to be here.
Tell us a little bit give us a little bit of background. What kind of shape were you in when you heard about Neurokinetics? Why did you end up there?
I had fallen into a very deep depression after 20 years working in a high stressful job and many layers of trauma underneath that I was somewhat unaware of. And I came to the point where I knew I was going to have to call my doctor and check myself into the hospital, and I thought, oh dear, I'm already on antidepressants. Do I want more medication, or can I find a slightly different way of finding this? And I was given the website address for Neurokinetics, so I went online, looked it up, and went, I think this is more to my liking. So when I first came into the office, it actually took me 6 weeks to get myself out of the house and into see Philippe for the first time. And that became the beginning of life again for me.
The 6 weeks, Dorothy, sorry to interrupt, but I'm just curious because the 6 week time lapse, that was just a function of the depression, wasn't it? It just took you that long to sort of focus and energize yourself to the point where you could go do something, right?
Depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
Just to prepare myself to leave the house, to meet new people, to get into the car and drive.
So I'm curious, though. You talked about this condition of depression and reluctance to even circulate with the rest of the world. How did you go to work every day?
I hadn't worked for a number of years.
You just checked yourself out of the workforce, huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
A series of incidents. I had been working. A series of incidents happened over a 6 week period that just would have brought just about anybody to their knees, and the last one being laid off my job, and I just threw up my hands and went, okay, I surrender.
Right.
And then working with my counselor, we were trying to work through the depression that we knew I had then, and we kept on running into a brick wall. And I thought, I'm blocked somehow. Something's blocking me, and I've got to find. And that's why I knew medications were not the route for me.
Well, I was just about to ask you. You described yourself earlier as having been prescribed antidepressants. Did they do anything for you?
They kept me in the workforce for a number of years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm grateful that I had them for the period of time and the relief it gave me, but there was more to it.
So you said you were at a point, literally at a fork in the road, where either you were going to check yourself into a hospital or you were going to go find some alternative method of resolving this problem. So you were it was so debilitating psychologically and physically, Dorothy, that you felt you had to go to the hospital? You were just physically that run down?
Yes.
Wow. And that's just a function of not really having a lot of energy or purpose in life, it sounds like.
Well, it was a combination, I realized later, of, as I started working with Philippe, is, at least for me, there was an underlying number of layers of trauma in my life from a very young age.
Right.
That if it's not dealt with, your mind locks it away in a closet someplace. And you put enough layers of those, one on top of the other, eventually your brain is just not going to be able to deal with it.
I understand. So, Dorothy, before you went to Philippe and he began this elaborate process of unraveling all of these events in your life so that you could eventually have them out in front of you and go, oh my gosh, look what happened, and look at and the cause and effect relationship of all of these events. When you went to other medical practitioners, was that process of determining traumatic events or regressing to find out what went off the rails many years ago, was that ever even initiated?
No. No, I was dismissed. Most often, I was dismissed.
And you were obviously you were prescribed antidepressants.
Yeah.
And what other remedies, if any, were offered to you?
None. I took my own initiative to find an excellent counselor who worked the best that he could to help me, but he can only do so much.
And was the counselor in question a psychologist, that sort of counseling type person?
He wasn't a psychologist, but he was extremely well trained.
Right. Okay. But still, but it's a medical thing. In addition to the psychology of it all, the depression, it physically, you were about to go to the hospital, Dorothy. You were so medically challenged.
I couldn't care for myself. That's what depression, if you go deep enough into it, you get to the point where you don't dress, you don't bathe, you sit in a chair for 12 hours a day, you get up, you go sleep for 12 hours, and you get up the next morning and you sit in a chair for 12 hours.
Dorothy, what sort of support systems do you have in your life, or did you have in your life during all of this? Did you have a spouse? Do you have children, family members, a roommate, anybody close to you that you could at least kind of share what the heck was going on?
My sister knew, and she was my lifeline. And there were a few other friends who were also aware, and they felt helpless.
And the other aspect of depression and anxiety that we're trying to zoom in on the program today, Dorothy, is the mental health nature of the problem, because it's seen as there's a stigma attached to anxiety and depression. You're seen as a bit of a mental health risk. Did you encounter that in your workplace at all? Were you very reluctant to share with any of your work colleagues any of this stuff in your life?
Nobody knew.
Right.
No, nobody knew, because how do you describe something you can't see? And I don't blame people, because unless you have a context of which that someone's explaining something to you, if you have a context that you can connect to understand, then people can have empathy and compassion for you.
Right.
But when they hear my story of sitting in a chair for 12 hours and sleeping for 12 hours, nobody can connect to that. So it's very difficult for people, because you don't have a cast on your leg, or you
Right.
don't have a bandage on your arm.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something foreign, because there's been such a stigma attached to what they sort of call quote-unquote illness. I think of it as I now know, the connections in my brain weren't working anymore. And once they start working, then you go back to being who you are.
And that's Philippe's whole point. The depression and the anxiety, they're always much deeper than what appears on the surface. Correct?
Correct.
Right. And in some cases, I'm curious, have you got a second to walk us through? Sonia's talked to us in previous episodes of the program about what happens to a person when they call Neurokinetics going, for goodness sake, please help. You've been there, you've done that. Walk us through what happened to you when you called.
When I called, I was set up with an appointment, and it was explained to me that Philippe starts with a balance test. And at that point, I just said, okay. I was willing to somehow just go on pure faith that this was the road that I had to take. So
Right.
When I arrived at the clinic, Philippe took me into his testing room and worked his magic. The man has a brilliant mind, and I'll let him explain to you what that's all about. But I could tell, standing in that room, my balance was off, and my body was completely and totally out of balance. And he gave me the results at the end and said to me, Dorothy, I can help you. And that's all that I needed to hear. And I started sessions with him immediately, using different techniques. I was so sensitive to touch of any sort that it took him a little while to sort through his army of needles that he uses for acupuncture.
Oh, right, of course.
Until he found what I could tolerate.
Right.
And within a couple of weeks, I had a situation that showed me just how quickly changes could be made. At that point in time, I could barely talk to a clerk without bursting into tears. And a friend of mine called me in crisis and said, "Dorothy, I need help. I have nowhere else to turn." And
Right.
this was a very close friend. And I thought, oh, can I help her? And as she was telling her story, I realized I'm not crying.
Mm-hmm.
I can deal with this. I can handle this. I was amazed. And I went, okay, this is really something.
And how far into the weeks of therapy and treatment with Dr. Philippe were you at that point when you realized this is working? I can actually be a benefit to other people. How far along were you?
2-3 weeks.
Wow, that is quick.
Yeah. I was expecting 2-3 months.
Yes.
Now, each person is an individual, and had that situation happened, I don't know whether I would have noticed it or been cognizant of it quite so quickly, but because it was a crisis, it showed itself that quickly.
Mm-hmm. So when you went and sought out Sonia and Philippe and the gang at Neurokinetics Clinic, when you went there and realized pretty quickly that these people, A, were quite prepared to sit down and listen to you and put you through the assessment process and began to help you almost immediately, were you ever afraid when by the time you got to Neurokinetics? Were you afraid of what people might think about you even in this new place? Or were you so far down the road with all of that stuff, Dorothy, you were just happy to get there?
I was just happy to be there, and I sensed with Philippe he's an incredibly compassionate and empathetic man, and because of my history of trauma, he had to know. I had to tell him all the stories.
Sure.
And he was the first one who listened.
And that's a big part of it, isn't it,
Yeah.
Philippe? Getting the actual life story of the individual who's come to see you. I mean, they put themselves out. The very least you can do is hear their story, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and understanding the chronology of whatever has happened adversely is critically important as well.
Right. Now, Dorothy, how long ago did this treatment program end at Neurokinetics?
3-4 years ago.
Oh my!
I'm horrible with dates and times. I just know that life is. I have my life back,
Right.
and I know that I will never be in depression again.
And are there follow-up sessions that you need to do once a year or every 6 months or any of that stuff, or have they seen the last of you?
No, they've not seen the last of me. Because I find that once you understand how your brain works, you know when it's not functioning completely correctly, and you go in for a tune-up. It's not like they say, okay, we need to see you, Dorothy. Now, each person is an individual, so I can't speak for others. But, I mean, if I fall or I have a physical accident, one of the first phone calls I'm making is to Philippe.
Oh, okay. Because of the traumatic nature. Is it possible, Philippe, while we've got Dorothy on the line, is it possible to go through the program as Dorothy has successfully done and fall back? Do you need to maintain a certain attitude and outlook and, as Dorothy says, perhaps even show up for a tune-up every now and then?
Well, it's a matter of need. It is a matter of need, and under pressure we tend to get fatigued, and out of that we may slide away a little bit from a standpoint of brain controls, if you will. So I don't want to be technical here, but in short, is under the pressures, lifestyle pressures,
Sure.
Professional, occupational pressures, we tend to get fatigued and worn out once in a while, and if there is vulnerabilities, that would be where problems may begin to kick in.
Right.
So it is preventative as well as, repairing or fixing a little bit. And I forgive the technicality of the word fixing here, but
No.
yes, it is it is that mindset. So it is on an as-needed basis exclusively.
Dorothy, only a couple of minutes left here, and we do appreciate your time and your courage in coming forward to discuss this with us. It's very kind of you. A lot of people listen to this program. This is Boomer Life. A lot of people who are 50 plus, and a lot of people who are at a point in their lives where the script isn't turning out the way I wanted it to be written, and that's really depressing. So talk to those people in terms of overcoming the fears and particularly the stigma, Dorothy, to get to where you are, to that, and I don't mean to sound facetious, but to kind of a happy place, if you don't mind my saying so.
Well, it is a happy place. And what I'd like to say to anybody out there is it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks of you. Who's important is what you think of yourself. And if things aren't happening or going the way you want them to, then this is the time to create that life for you. You can. You just have to make that decision.
Right. And once the decision is taken, however, whatever amount of time it takes to execute the decision, in your case it was about 6 weeks, it's time well spent nonetheless, isn't it?
Oh, it's given me back the rest of my life. And I couldn't even begin to imagine. And when your body is performing at peak performance, so is your mind. Mm-hmm. And you see the possibilities, and you can take those possibilities by the throat and just run with it. Whereas if you're feeling fatigued, you're feeling tired, and you can't even think of, I can't think of going back to school.
Right.
Well, yeah, you can. And you can learn, or you can, create that garden in your backyard or travel the world. It's all there within you. All you have to do is have it unlocked again. It doesn't go away. It's still there. Mm-hmm. You just have to find a way to re-access it, and that's what Philippe does.
Wow. What a fantastic testimonial. I must say, you are a pretty impressive guest, Dorothy. Thank you so much for this. Wonderful to speak to you, and I'm so glad to hear you're doing so well.
Thank you.
My pleasure entirely. We need to take a quick break here on Boomer Life, but when we come back, we're going to ask our two guests, how did you do that? After this time out on CIL 650.
Canada's only weekly radio show dedicated to the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on CIL 650.